Thank you, Andrew. Although, I don't know if I'm just speaking for myself, but I am not quite ready to forego the pubic option. I'm not. It's my great pleasure to be here. I've known about and had pop tech envy for many years, and I'm happy to finally be at least temporarily drawn into your circle. So we don't get far behind, let me begin. It used to be that decades lasted, a decade. The 1950s started with the post-war boom, ended with the pill and the Beatles and Camelot. About 10 years. The 60s, as we know them, were definitively done by the early 70s, and the 70s ended right on schedule pretty much in 1980 with the election of Ronald Reagan. Decades lasted a decade. But the 1980s, what we know as the 80s politically and culturally and economically, let's say is defined by Reaganism and the Wall Street boom that began in 1982, the bull market, the thrill of those first PCs and CDs and cell phones in the early 80s. The 80s just kept on going and kept going and kept going. And despite a couple of small recessions, despite even 9/11, despite a Democratic president who served 2 terms, the 80s endured until last fall. But it really, during the 90s, during the aughts, the stock market climbed from 800 to 14,000, debt exploded, personal savings went from an average per household of 11% to something close to 0. Money got cheaper and cheaper. We all know those stories. Living large as a phrase was coined, and by the way, living large, while it was meant figuratively, we certainly did it literally as well. As the average American home during those 25 years increased by 50%, even as the average American family shrank. The average car got bigger and more powerful and less efficient. We were certainly living large. It was as if we decided that Mardi Gras and Christmas were so fun, let's just make them year-round ways of life. And I think on some level, most of us were guilty in some form of a kind of magical thinking. Even smart, rational people. Remember the new economy? Sometimes even the smartest people, I would argue, engage in magical thinking. No one really wanted to be a buzzkill. So why did this happen? I'm going to talk about 2 big reasons that it happened today. First, because we're Americans, and that's how we roll, and I'll get to that in a minute. But also, I think, because my generation and some of your generation, the baby boomers, pulled off a very neat trick. We took Peter Pan seriously. We took Bob Dylan's lyrics seriously. We didn't want to grow up, so we didn't. We committed to staying forever young and sort of changed the rules to be able to live that dream. And everyone has followed in our footsteps. I mean, when did adults start celebrating Halloween? Adults without children. When did people over 12 begin eating Pop-Tarts and ice cream with mashed up cookie dough in it? When did grown-ups start watching movies with spaceships and superheroes and reading comic books and listening to the same music as teenagers do and wearing blue jeans and sneakers all the time? Which is fine, all of which is fine. I like never putting on a necktie. I like wearing jeans and sneakers all the time. I will watch The Simpsons and eat cookie dough ice cream until the end of time. Life is more fun than it was for adults of my parents' and grandparents' generation, but there really have been some unforeseen consequences to this forever young paradigm that has really had hegemony in our culture for the last 40 years. Why has short-term thinking become so entrenched and in so many ways so problematic in our economy? Well, who doesn't think long-term? Children. Waiting to get what you want is a definition of maturity, one definition of maturity. Demanding satisfaction right this instant is pretty much the definition of a 7-year-old, as you will find out, Andrew, soon enough. The quest for instant gratification has really become the economic and cultural driver in America in the last few decades in a way that it simply wasn't before. Get those earnings up right now, send a message now, get an answer now, pick your airline seat now, watch this movie at home now, buy anything you want right now. The web and cell phones and FedEx, all of it, they are great, but they also indulge every day in every way that impulsive inner child within us all. And if you want the politics of the last few months explained, the shouting and the screaming in the town halls, just imagine what children do when they don't get their way. They throw a tantrum. So the economic collapse had everything to do with credit policies and financial regulation and more, but I really do think that our 4 decades celebrating this sort of selfish youthiness made our reckless spree bigger and longer and deeper, and our politics brattier. Now, the second thing that brought us here is, and explains where we've been, is in the nature of America. If we could look at this little PowerPoint that Andrew has personally created to illustrate what I'm talking about. Now, I have a clicker, don't I? Our economy is famously marked by big expansions and big contractions, wild prosperity alternating with sky is falling panics, booms and busts. So the economy is one set of one axis, and then we can call it left and right, but there's this separate set of cycles of the zeitgeist. We go back and forth between this sort of unfettered zeal for individual getting and spending, and then back to more of a focus on the common good. Now, that cyclical swing in the sort of political and cultural zeitgeist, that's nothing new. Before Arthur Schlesinger Jr., before Arthur Schlesinger Sr., back in the 19th century, Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry Adams saw this happening from the beginning. So there are these economic booms and busts, and then these sort of socio-cultural swings. Now, so they're happening simultaneously over this timeline, but think of one as happening vertically, which is to say the booms and the busts, and the other one happening horizontally, moving to the left and the right. And they are these cycles that are happening, and they obviously interact, and they each affect each other, but in these complex ways, because each one has its own sort of waxing and waning dynamic. So we're swinging left and right, sometimes for 10 years at a time, sometimes, as we just experienced, for much longer. And then, at the same time, the booms and the busts happen. Now, again, these don't correspond. As you see, we can have booms and busts within the middle of a longer political era, and so they are connected, but they are not identical. Now, and this has happened, as I say, since the beginning. We've had, in terms of the zeitgeist cycles, what you see is the green there. We're now starting the 15th since the beginning. So this happens, but every now and then, an economic crash coincides with the kind of natural, inevitable end of a conservative political era, making the sort of historical waves fall powerfully into sync. That's what happened in the 1930s. We've heard a lot in the last year about, this is the excess we've been, or the deepest, or the worst, or whatever, since the Great Depression. But it really is interesting that what happened in 1930, well, 1930 was coming off 3 straight conservative presidencies. This period of amazing technological progress, electrification, radio, aviation, automobiles, and a culture, the roaring 20s, of letting the good times roll. So we are now at the beginning, as I say, of this 15th one of these cycles. And while we avoided a depression this time, blessedly, the other big difference from the 1929 and the 1930s is how long this boom has lasted. The Roaring 20s really were a decade, barely a decade, whereas this latest go-go era lasted 25, 26 years, which means that at least half of Americans have never known any other way of life. And that's important, I think, for these days here, because it means our task now, if we're serious about reinventing and reimagining and resetting ourselves, is that much more challenging, because no one, certainly under 30, knows anything but these happy days that we've just experienced for the last 25 years. So how do we do it? There are people who are, and we all, if we're sentient, have moments of cynicism and despair about our ability to actually undertake change. But I tell people, look, we've just done it. We have just undergone an extraordinary period of change. We just didn't set out to do it in this kind of concerted way 25 years ago. But in addition to all the bad habits we acquired during the last 25 years, think of all the change, much of it, if not all of it, benign, that we sort of created and adapted to. 25 years ago, we had 3 or 4 channels and a phone company, and we adapted to hundreds of TV channels and multiple phone companies. We have adapted in all these ways to the weird transparency and always-on connectedness of the digital world. We sequenced the human genome. We watched and helped the Soviet Union collapse, and watched and helped China turn from this backward, impoverished, scary nation into a booming, rather less scary member of the global order. We reduced murder and crime everywhere. In New York City, I can't repeat this enough as a New Yorker. We reduced murder in New York City by 2/3 in a matter of a few years. Women in these 25 years have come vastly closer to true equality of expectations and opportunity. Being gay in much of America has become, and in the national conversation, has become astoundingly unremarkable. Half of smokers in the last 25 years have quit smoking. We elected a black president. So huge change is possible. As I've talked to people around the country, since this book in which I talk about these ideas came out this summer, Reset, I have encountered people again and again who say, yeah, my family and I are suddenly living within our means. We're lucky enough to still have a job or jobs, but they're discovering that living within one's means does not diminish quality of life, and indeed letting go of this acquisitive fever, letting the 1980s end, finally, can make them feel better. Now, going forward, where do we get out of this? You're going to hear all kinds of ideas this weekend about where we might go. The venture capitalists I've talked to, even in the depths of the recession 9 months ago, a year ago, weren't quite giddy, but they were certainly optimistic about a kind of imminent tide of innovations in technology and energy and transportation. And when one thinks, again, at the depths of, oh my God, woe is us, the automobile industry is dying, where do we go, what's going to happen? Again, taking the slightly longer view, think back to the 1970s, after our kind of 1960s, late 60s spree. It was in that kind of malaise period of the 1970s that, for instance, FedEx and Microsoft and Apple were founded, at the depths of that malaise. And now, I think, certainly, that in business, as some of the sort of dominant old growth trees fall, I'm thinking Detroit, I'm thinking much of the old media, doesn't it give room for the seedlings and saplings in our economic forest to have a clearer field and more sky toward which to grow? There is, no question, pain and of a serious kind as the old industries die off and there's the sudden impending void. But that very void is what gives opportunity for newer, smaller enterprises. Now, again, we don't go, even with the tremendous shock of last year, and if anything, I think the shock of last year is fading rather dangerously quickly, but we don't change overnight. It's suddenly, we're not all, Americans are not going to become ascetics. But I do think that more Americans will begin to aim, because those cycles do run, and they may stop, but so far, 220 years, they haven't. More Americans will aim to do work that makes them happy rather than merely well-to-do. For instance, this year, just this year, you all know Teach for America? 1 in 9 Ivy League graduates have joined Teach for America this year, which is an extraordinary number. For my radio show, Studio 360, we have all year been talking to people who have been, for one reason or another in the last year, out of jobs. They were fired, they were laid off, their companies went belly up, who have reinvented themselves as that thing they always wanted to do. We talked to an investment banker who has become a fashion designer and is creating eco-conscious clothes and selling them online. We talked to a guy in Tacoma who had a construction management company that went belly up. He is now creating gallery furniture pieces with half his time, and the other half of his time doing the other thing he always wanted to do, cook. He's cooking in an old people's home. These people have reinvented themselves and seen this moment as an opportunity to do that. We all talk about sustainability, I think, too narrowly as a strictly environmental, climate change-focused idea about recycling and fuel efficiency, all of which, obviously, I'm not going to gainsay. But sustainability is really a key as we go forward. You know, the degree to which we use cheap money and credit over the last 20 years was unsustainable. Our system of health care is unsustainable. Our war on drugs is unsustainable. Sustainability, it seems to me, we have to think of way beyond environmentally sound practices and really bring back to it, as part of it, that old-fashioned green eye shade Republican, old Republican way of saying, how can we really do this? How is this sustainable over the long term financially? I think, you know, people accuse me, and I accuse myself of finding too many silver linings amid the storm clouds. But as the real estate development craze pauses, I hope and I believe we have a moment to begin thinking for real about smart growth and less unplanned sprawl. But I really do think that a big key, if the story of our renewal and reinvention and reimagining is to be written, and 20 years from now we look back and say, we really did turn the corner at the beginning of the 21st century, I think it's going to be about, a big part of it's going to be about finding and embracing that part of the American spirit, which is the amateur spirit. This country, after all, was created by passionate amateurs. Democracy is government by amateurs. Benjamin Franklin was a printer. Thomas Jefferson was a lawyer. They became famous as, in Franklin's case, being an amateur inventor, Jefferson's case being an amateur architect, pretty good, and of course, as amateur political philosophers. I want to read you a quote from the historian and former late Librarian of Congress, Daniel Borstein, who said, "The amateur is not afraid to do something for the first time. The rewards and refreshments of thought and the arts come from the courage to try something, all sorts of things, for the first time. An enamored amateur need not be a genius to stay out of the ruts he has never been trained in." Now, it's not about being an amateur in the modern kind of attenuated sense that we've come to think of it, about not being paid for doing something, but it's about embodying the spirit of the amateur, infusing all of our occupations as much as possible with that passion and enthusiasm of avocation. Amateurs are passionate. They don't worry so much about breaking rules. They're not paralyzed by a fear of failure, of somebody criticizing them. They embrace new challenges. The very root of the word amateur is the Latin amator, which means lover. You do what you do because you love to do it. Entrepreneurialism is one way in which the amateur spirit can be lashed to the market to try to get paid for doing this crazy thing, whatever it is that you love and that you make up as you go along. Now, for all of the bad habits and craziness of the last 20 years, At the same time, one of the happy byproducts has been a renaissance of the amateur spirit. I'm talking, of course, about the digital revolution, the creation of the web, the creation of the internet. That original hacker spirit was that American tinkerer, amateur spirit, the desire to make something useful and cool, and maybe make money off it, but not necessarily. And in the open source movement, and as thousands and thousands of people publish and create web apps and make music and make films, that amateur spirit, which had really died, which had almost died for most of the last century, I think has had a renaissance and a revival that, if we're lucky enough to be carried through to a new era, will be one of the things that gets us there. There's a paradox in all this. You know, to have the chutzpah to behave like an amateur, live the dream, to hell with naysayers. It also requires a real humility, because to have that kind of amateur spirit, you have to throw yourself into situations where you're uncertain, where you're ignorant, and are therefore obliged to figure out new ways of seeing problems and fresh ways of solving them. Now, I like paradoxes. I like I'm no Buddhist, I'm no religious anything, but I do like the Buddhist idea of the beginner's mind. The Zen master, 20th century Zen master Suzuki famously wrote, "In the beginner's mind, there are many possibilities, but in the expert's mind, there are few," which is very much like the core idea that Daniel Borstein set out for the amateur spirit, when he says, "The main obstacle to progress is not ignorance, but the illusion of knowledge." Now, this isn't just airy-fairy philosophy. It's real. As Steve Jobs said, after he was purged from Apple, after he came back and created Pixar and made Apple Reborn, he talked about his pleasure, retroactively, of being purged and fired. The heaviness of being successful, he said, was replaced by the lightness of being a beginner again, less sure about everything. It freed me to enter one of the most creative periods of my life. Now, I know what he means. I got fired as the editor of New York Magazine 13 years ago. It was traumatic. It was difficult. But it also freed me to reimagine myself as a novelist, as a host of a public radio show. And finding my way ever since has been thrilling as well as gratifying. And I only hope that after a few days at PopTech, that you and Americans and America, well, can have as good luck as I have at figuring out how to reinvent and reimagine yourself and climb out of the hole or the holes in which we currently find ourselves. Thank you very much.